The Waco 10, later called the GXE, was the most successful light aircraft of its time. Although in many ways unremarkable, it had nevertheless outsold every other aircraft in its class in the United States by the time production ended in 1933, and this is a position it held on to until it was displaced by the Piper Cub. But like the Cub, the 10 was an aircraft of the people, and this meant it was built down to a price. It depended for its success on mass production using cheap and widely available parts, particularly the engine. That engine, usually the Curtiss OX5, later followed by the OXX6, had been designed in 1910 and was already considered obsolete when it was chosen to power the JN4 trainer in 1915. The 10 had a relatively clean airframe that helped it make the best of that engine, but performance, and not to mention reliability, were best described as modest. Probably one of the things that made the Wacos as successful as they were was the balance that the company struck between innovation on the one hand and good business sense. Clay Bruckner, one of the original founders, had worked at Curtiss as an assembly line foreman, and in most accounts of the company he's always the one pushing to exploit successful products while minimising risk and development costs. But the name of Charlie Myers comes up over and over again as an opposing force pushing for innovation. It was Myers who pushed Bruckner to develop the 10 in the first place rather than sticking with the successful Model 9, and he also had the foresight to insist on an airframe strong enough to allow experiments with other engine options, even as the production lines turned out the bargain basement Curtiss powered aircraft. A number of successful engine options emerged, but one in particular stands out as the winner, and this was the Wright J5 Whirlwind engine. 1927 saw the first successful test of a J5 powered 10, which was variously called the 10W or the Waco Sport, 10220, and any one of 20 other names. It was finally designated the ASO, and the company introduced its three-letter codes later that year. The A identifies the J5 engine, the S is the wing type, straight wings in this case, and the O denotes the fuselage type. All the 10s have the same fuselage type. Now the front end of this aircraft looks a lot different to the OX5 powered 10, and that's because the J5's a radial engine. Of course, this was also a period of rapid development in engine technology, and radial engines had a number of big advantages over inlines like the OX5. They were usually air-cooled for one thing, which saved a lot of complicated and often quite heavy plumbing. They were also simpler in design and in accessibility for maintenance. There were other mechanical advantages to a radial layout, so for example a shorter crankshaft with fewer bearings, and all of these things added up to greater reliability. Produced in 1925, the Wright J5 was the engine that took Charles Lindbergh across the Atlantic, and it was widely regarded as the first truly reliable aircraft engine. At 220 horsepower it had more than twice the pulling power as the OX5 engine, and it transformed the Model 10 from a competent but uninspiring enthusiast's machine into a sporty and very practical hot rod. Now, to some eyes, the J5 may have spoiled the 10's elegant lines, but that radial front end was to become an aesthetic in its own right, with connotations of raw power and speed. Most considered that this configuration gave the Model 10 airframe the engine it deserved and made the aircraft a joy to fly. Something else to point out here is the engine in this aircraft isn't actually a J5 at all, it's a 235 horsepower J6, which is why it has 7 cylinders instead of the J5's 9. Don't forget that each aircraft in this package is modelled on a particular real-world aircraft, and at some point in its history this one's had its engine upgraded. In practice, flying the simulator doesn't really convey the huge difference in feel that these two aircraft would have had in real life, but the power differential is faithfully modelled. Here we're attempting a best performance take-off and climb out at maximum weight, and there's no doubt about the outcome, even with the ASO running 400 pounds heavier. Apart from that, the two feel surprisingly similar, except for the performance in marginal conditions. Of course, the ASO drinks literally twice as much fuel as the basic GXE, which is why it carries twice as much. So on the approach, again, the simulated ASO is fairly similar in feel to the Model 10 and the tank-ended GXE, except it can get you out of trouble faster if you mess things up. It's a foot shorter than the GXE, another consequence of that radial engine, but in practice this doesn't make a lot of difference. It's got a steerable tail wheel, which makes ground handling much easier. So many regard the ASO as the definitive Model 10, and yet between 1927 and the end of its production in 1931 it sold only 95 units, while the basic Curtiss equipped Model 10 sold 395 in 1927 alone. The truth is that Wright Whirlwind engine alone cost twice as much as a complete OX5 equipped Model 10, and normal folks just couldn't afford it. So we've seen how adding a decent engine to the basic Model 10 makes a huge difference. So in the next part we're going to look at the competition Wacos, and arguably the sportiest Model 10 and the most sought after competition ride there was.